Hello, my name is Sonali and I welcome you all to this week's Sunday special episode of Around the World in 7 Days. You must already be knowing about the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and for now at least, the world doesn't seem to have a solution to this crisis. Although after the beginning of the war, Europe along with the US had thought if they imposed sanctions on Russia, Russia would become weak. Its economy will collapse and it will be forced to end the war under pressure. Given this, these countries had imposed economic sanctions on Russia. This also included a ban on the purchase of crude oil from Russia. But the execution of their plans could not deliver much in real. Countries like India and China were not much bothered by these restrictions. These countries kept buying crude oil from Russia. One interesting thing in this is that these countries are importing more oil after the war than they used to import from Russia before the war. According to figures before the Russia-Ukraine war in February last year, the share of Russian oil in India's imports was just 1%. But in 1 year, that is by February 2023, this share has increased to 35%. By this time, India was buying around 16 lakh barrels of crude oil per day from Russia. According to Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, his country has increased its oil sales to India by 22% in the last 1 year. Indian private companies are now taking advantage of the increased oil supply from Russia. These companies saw Europe as the best market for their refined oil products. If we look at the statistics, the export of refined oil products India to Europe has reached a record level. In this way, even though the European Union has banned the direct purchase of Russian oil, it is buying a lot of Russian oil through India. But the question is, why is Europe doing this? Is Europe still buying Russian oil despite sanctions? Is India helping Russia transport oil to Europe? How did the demand for Indian refined oil products in Europe increase so much that India emerged as a major player? Apart from this, the question is whether India is emerging as a reliable supplier. So let's find answers to these questions one by one. To punish Russia for its attack on Ukraine, the European Union almost banned Russia's crude oil in December last year. Then 2 months later, intensifying these restrictions, Russia's refined oil products were also banned. It is worth noting that before the ban, Europe was buying almost 30% of its oil from Russia. But the imposition of sanctions created a supply gap in Europe. It was believed that this would create a supply shortage across Europe, including the European Union. This was a matter of greater concern for the whole of Europe, as the countries here were already grappling with high inflation rates. This situation was like a double-edged sword for the European Union. On one hand, the supply chain from Russia was cut off, which was earlier Europe's top supplier. And on the other hand, they also had to control inflation in their countries. That's why they needed an alternative source from Russia. In such a situation, private companies of India saw this as a good opportunity to fill this supply gap in Europe. According to data, exports of refined petroleum products from India to EU countries continued to grow for 5 consecutive months till January last year. This particular month, it reached 1.9 million tons. This was the highest monthly figure for the financial year 2022-23. From April 2022 to January 2023, the export of refined petroleum from India to Europe increased to 11.6 million tons. In this way, the European Union reached the top among the 20 regions where India was exporting its refined petroleum products. The European market alone accounted for about 15% of India's exports of refined petroleum products during this period. Later, this figure increased to about 22%. According to a report by an organization called Kepler, in the coming days, the export of refined petroleum products from India to Europe may increase further. Significantly, despite the sanctions, India is buying large quantities of crude oil from Russia at a subsidized rate. Indian companies are exporting this oil to Europe after refining it. According to Kepler's data, the supply of Russian crude oil to India is expected to be more than 2 million barrels per day in April, which is almost equal to 44% of the country's total oil imports. That's why it is being said that Europe is now buying Russian oil indirectly through India instead of directly buying it from Russia. Now the question is whether India is emerging as a reliable supplier to Europe. The US and European countries do not want the supply chain to be disrupted due to sanctions on Russia. If this were the case, they would not have brought the plan of a price cap for Russia. Under this scheme, a provision was made that the countries which are buying oil from Russia should not buy oil from it at more than a certain price. Through this, they wanted to reduce the economic status of Russia. However, India and China rejected the draft plan, and since then, both countries are buying oil from Russia at the fixed price only. On the other hand, after the ban on Russian oil, there was an oil crisis in European countries. Because of this, the import of petroleum products started increasing there. Indian companies also took their active participation in this. Although earlier European countries did not buy much refined products from India, now given the current crisis, these countries have started giving importance to Indian products. It will be a matter of relief for the US and European countries that the global oil supply of India's refining companies remains intact, because this will ensure their supply too. Especially for Europe, because of the rising inflation, the cost of oil there is very sensitive. In such a situation, America and Europe are feeling that increasing exports of Indian refining companies is a good sign to save the global supply of oil from shock. So, it is also a good thing for India's economic potential. Due to this, India will continue to emerge as a reliable supplier. Along with this, there is also a possibility of India's supply chain emerging as a strong link. And based on these reasons, European countries along with America can trust India. Now it's turn for this program's Sunday special segment, in which we will talk about other important international news. Human Rights Watch has released a report titled "When We Moved, They Shot." It presents a detailed analysis of the 4-day conflict that erupted in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in September 2022. It has been told that during this period, the armies of both countries have been found involved in war crimes. According to reports, Kyrgyz security forces fired at ambulances and private cars and dropped a laser-guided bomb in the city square during the clashes, killing at least 10 civilians. At the same time, Tajik forces fired on cars carrying civilians and illegally killed at least 8 civilians under various circumstances. There was also widespread looting and burning of private property in villages in Kyrgyzstan controlled by Tajik forces. According to Human Rights Watch, all these activities come under war crimes. Finance ministers of Japan and South Korea have met for the first time in the last 7 years. In this meeting, both countries agreed to resume regular talks to reduce tensions in the region. After this meeting, the leaders issued a joint statement. It warned of risk to the region's economy. In addition, it has called for countries to be vigilant about possible spillovers from the recent US and European banking sector turmoil. At the same time, Japanese Finance Minister Shunichi Suzuki said that Japan and South Korea are important neighbors. Therefore, the two countries should cooperate to address various challenges surrounding the global economy as well as the regional and international community. On the other hand, the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, visited America. His visit was special in that it was the first time in the last 10 years that a Filipino leader had visited the White House. During the visit, he met US President Joe Biden. In this meeting, Biden told Marcos that the US commitment to protect its allies is like an ironclad, that is, a strong iron ship. According to Biden, these allies also include the Philippines, which is under pressure from China these days. Apart from this, both countries have reaffirmed their decades-old security alliance in this visit. A joint statement issued after the meeting said any armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels or aircraft in the Pacific, including the South China Sea, would invoke US defense commitments under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. So that's all in this episode. See you on Wednesday. But before leaving, let's note down the practice question based on today's story. In the current global scenario, possibilities have emerged for India in which the market for refined petroleum products is prominent. Present your views in the light of this statement.